Well, good evening. Welcome to another episode of True Story Live. And tonight's episode is a continuation, part two with Brandee. The Cage is Open, Fly, a story of deconstruction, part two. Super excited about what we have tonight and excited where we're going to go with it. And really loved last week's broadcast. We went for about an hour and a half. And for those that plan on telling a story, we're going to shoot for that in the future. I think we used to do 2 hour broadcasts back in the day. And sometimes when we really started, sometimes we did 3 and 4 hour broadcasts, which it's hard for me to imagine doing now. Maybe it's just that I'm older and I can't swing with the young kids anymore. I don't know. But uh, about an hour and a half seems to be the right length. And Brandee just happened to be the perfect guest. I barely had to do anything or pull anything out of her, but I don't mind doing that. I'm good at that. We've had other guests in the past that need a little prompting, but that was not the case with Brandee, and that's wonderful. So it just went it was very fluid and got a lot of her story out. So the plan for tonight is to spend about an hour, and Brandee will continue telling her deconstruction story. And I think she'll probably talk a little about what reconstruction looks like for her, or that can be a question that I might ask at the end. But we'll leave some time open at the end for anyone in the chat that does have any questions for her, and maybe Jen and myself would have questions for her too. And then we'll close up tonight's broadcast. Before we begin, just want to remind everyone, if you're listening to this and you do want to tell your story here on True Story Live, and by the way, it doesn't have to be a deconstruction story. It can be any true story. That's what the name of the channel is, True Story Live. And just as a reminder for those that didn't listen last week, this is the way I intended the channel to be: people telling true stories live, and any kind of stories. It could be a story of how you survived some horrific event. It could be a story from your childhood that you think other people would want to hear about. Anything. Now, we do like stories of deconstruction and reconstruction because that's kind of what Jen and myself have been going through for a while. And so these are interesting stories, and there's a lot of it going on right now in the world. And I've watched a lot of that content myself, and everybody, has their own opinions and things like that. And we wanted to provide an open and safe place for people to tell their stories with us. So anyway, getting to it. If you want to tell your story on this channel, please send us an email. I'll put it in the chat at the end as well, but it's True Story Live. So the name of the channel, .cripps, CRIPPS, @gmail.com. And like I said, I'll put that in at the end. I'm also doing it in the groups and the Facebook groups. And I would like to get to the point where we just are able to line some people up and have, 3 or 4 people on the schedule, one person a week or something like that. And we'll get there. It takes some time when you switch formats like this. And I expected that to happen. There are going to be people that don't come along on the journey with us, and that's okay. But hopefully there'll be new people. We'll meet new people, and those that did want to come along will realize that we're not on Sunday anymore, but we're on Friday. We did Sundays for so long. I think some people don't really realize that we've made the change yet, but we'll give it time. Anyway, I'm Jason. For those listening for the first time, I'm the host of the broadcast, but actually I have a co-host, which is my amazing wife, Jennifer. Jennifer, take a second to say hello to the people.
Hey, good to be here. I'm really excited to hear part 2. Brandee's so easy to listen to. She's got a beautiful voice and a wonderful story. A lot of dips and turns and just incredibly interesting. I love hearing people's stories. I'm right up there with you, Jason.
Right? Yeah. I've always just really liked stories, and ever since I was a kid, and I could go on and on about that, but I remember a lot of it, but my parents told me, my mom especially, and of course she's passed on now, but she would tell me all the time that I would grab a book and go get one of my parents or anyone really that was around, my grandparents, my aunt or uncle or whatever, and I would beg them to tell me a story. And a lot of times they would say yes, which is good. And then before I learned how to read, I had memorized the stories. I knew the story so well that I would interrupt and you know be part of the story. So it has been something that hasn't changed. I still love people's stories because I think it really opens up a different side to most people that are telling their story. You get a chance to know them better, of course, but they might say something that really makes you think, and that certainly is the case with tonight's guest. We have our friend Brandee, and she has a Facebook group that we're a part of, and it is The Cage is Open Fly. That's part of the title. And we're going to ask her probably toward the end to talk a little bit about her group if she wants to. But welcome, Brandee. How are you feeling tonight?
I'm good. Thank you for having me back.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I'm glad you were willing to come back because it's a lot. It'll end up being 3 hours, but it's a lot easier to break it up a little bit and do an hour and a half one Friday, an hour and a half gives you time to rest at
Yeah,
least, right?
right.
All right, Brandee. Last Friday we listened to the last part of the story, which you were talking about Yahweh and how you were really digging into studies, and that you were talking to your grandmother, and that's kind of where I feel we should start. And then let's see. I wanted just to mention real quick. I'd mentioned it to you off air, but I had a similar experience with the Yahweh thing, and I'd already, kind of been looking at some other things first, but that was really a catalyst for me personally. And I'm sure people come to this in many different ways, but that was pretty earth shattering to me to discover that. And it made me understand things in a completely different light, being able to separate, at least at that time for me, I hadn't decided there wasn't a God or anything like that. I still haven't decided that, but maybe not a God, maybe a creator or some spiritual figure. I mean, this we got here somehow, but to realize that the angry, vengeful, bloodthirsty God of the Old Testament was not the same, at least in the way it's presented as the New Testament God. That was a big piece of the puzzle for me. So I'll open up to you, and just start wherever you want at this point. Thank you, Brandee.
Yeah. So with the Yahweh thing, that was huge for me because it was I mean, it was earth shattering, right? Like it
Yeah,
was the foundation of what I had believed for so long. I didn't I guess like the churches that I went to, and then with our home fellowship and different things, we didn't use we didn't use that term Yahweh. We weren't
right, right,
using Yod He Vav He YHWH. We didn't do that.
right.
Um, we said God. We
Yeah,
used the generic, right? Like that was so. It wasn't until when we really began digging deeper and looking up the words and in the concordance and saying like, okay, what was the Greek word here and what was the Hebrew
yeah,
word here? And then when I had mentioned before that we got a Sefer, the Sefer Bible,
yeah.
and Sefer just means book,
Hmm.
but was supposedly, a more direct translation where they left the original word in. They didn't translate
Love it.
a lot of the words.
Yeah,
So I have very different feelings about the Sefer now, right? But it was an introduction to in the English, like here's a list of 10 words that are generically translated as God in English,
sure.
and they're all different when
Yeah,
you actually look them up. So
yeah. Big time.
that was eye-opening, right? We
Yep.
That was new, and we had a friend who attended one of the churches that we went to that was he was very charismatic, very likable guy. I still like him. But I remember him coming over one day with this folder, like a manila folder, and it was really like full, like a big thick stack of papers. And
Right.
he wanted to sit down with us and go over. It was like a study that he had. I don't know if he wrote it, um, or where he got it, but it was like a study through the names of God. So like Jehovah Jireh, Jehovah Rapha,
Right.
Jehovah, it was like all of these names. And
Right.
he loved that stuff, right? And he would be um he'd be praising and singing, and he'd be throwing in these names and that kind of stuff. And
Sure.
that was very new. It was new to me, right?
Right.
And of course all of those names were painted in a positive light that
Yeah.
or it kind of gave attributes to
Sure.
God, right?
Hmm.
um and so, but that was kind of like an introduction to, hey, it's not just generic God, right? And then I remember coming across different maybe YouTube videos or articles, and they were arguing that using God, was pagan, right? They like, this is it's wrong. Like, this is a corruption of
Right.
the scriptures, right? And that was interesting, and I could understand that, right? Because if this was God, if the Bible was God breathed, and this infallible, inerrant word of
Right.
God, and his very name, his very essence had been changed and
Oh.
diluted,
Oh my
because
gosh.
when you have God, or you have all these other terms, right? El
Yeah.
Elyon and
Yeah.
Yahweh, and
Right.
you just it really diluted
Hmm.
the beauty of it too,
Yeah.
because when people write these studies, they're doing it, I guess, like in a worshipful way, maybe you could say.
Yeah.
So they really play it up. It's super dramatic. At least the things that I saw, right?
Right.
um so that was like months, if not maybe even a couple years of really really diving into that, right?
Hmm.
And then I had mentioned before, when my sister, who is just so good with words, when she did that study and looked at the YHVH, or Yod He Vav He in the Hebrew, and then when they inserted the vowels, you could have Yahweh or you could have Jehovah, that
Right.
it was the very same thing, but two different denominations basically added different vowels, right?
Sure.
And
Yep.
pronounce it differently.
Yep.
And that, and when it came up, God of like chaos and wrath and destruction, and it was pretty alarming, right? It was like, it wasn't a good
Yeah.
thing.
No.
And
Not.
is that what you found too when you started looking at Yahweh?
Oh yeah. I mean, I'd always had trouble with looking at, okay, back when I thought it was God, right? With
Mm-hmm.
God's anger toward people and what I saw as a big ego, right?
Yeah.
Like, he seems to have an ego. Like, why is he so jealous? He admits, I'm a jealous God.
Right.
And but when you really look at it, it puts in a different light. It's like there's well, the New Testament says there's a veil over the Old Testament to this day, right?
Right. Yes. Yes.
And that, to me, when I remembered that verse and looking at it, it was like the veil was lifted. And I was like, oh, the veil is that for me, Yahweh is not God. Like,
Yes. We
it's
had the
something
same
else.
thing, the same verse too. That verse was pivotal
Yeah.
when we started to see it.
Yeah.
And I think that's what made it so traumatic. Also, it was because I believed the words of Jesus
Yeah.
wholeheartedly. And
Right.
so if Jesus was seeing Yahweh, or these characters, whether it was singular or plural in the Old
Right.
Testament, it's
Hmm.
debatable, right? If Jesus was not seeing that as his father, and yet I had spent all these years in a worshipful state
Hmm.
towards this being,
Yes.
I was like, oh my goodness, like the
Hmm.
deception just goes so much deeper than I could have
Yeah.
ever imagined. And of course, in my worldview at the time, it was angels and demons, dark and light,
Right.
good
Yeah.
and
Right.
bad. There really was no middle gray area. And we had already been through the NAR thing, and
Mhm.
the sleepy Baptist thing. We had been through
Sleepy
enough
Baptist.
things that we were like, we were very keen on what's deception and what
Sure.
isn't. We didn't have discernment necessarily about what was deception and what wasn't,
Right.
but we kind of, our worldview was we are deception hunters and we must stamp out
Ooh.
all deception and we must move in the way of truth. And Satan is cunning and devious, and
Mhm.
he masquerades as an angel of light. And so these things that so many people, including us at different times, were believing were good
Mhm.
and holy and true and right, like the character in the Old Testament being
Right.
God. I mean,
Yeah.
to us, that was like the ultimate deception. I
Yeah.
mean, it was, I cried, I shook. Like
Yeah.
I actually, when it really sunk in,
Yeah.
and it was like, it was huge, right? I
Yeah.
mean, I really felt like I had to check out for a few days. You know what I mean?
Sure.
Like mentally, because I was so
Yeah.
preoccupied with, I cannot believe that I have been deceived at this level. But it
Th-
wasn't just that, it was the magnitude of the millions of Christians
yes.
who are believing that this is the Father Creator love with a capital L that Jesus spoke
Yes.
of. I
Yes.
mean,
It's
how
a big
big is
deal.
that?
It's
Yeah.
huge. It is super, super huge.
And I don't mean to sound like super dramatic, but when your entire life
Mhm.
revolves around everything in our lives had been built on that worldview. Like we were the people that when we learned about like Walt Disney and Disney World and Hollywood and all of those things, like we
Right.
went through and destroyed every Disney DVD that we
Oh yeah.
had.
Sure.
We had given up the so-called pagan holidays.
Oh.
So that would have been my 9 years ago.
Mhm.
Um, that just seemed obvious because of our studies through the Old Testament, and we
Right.
truly had hearts to please God.
Yeah. Of
And
course.
if God was blatantly telling us that those things were pagan and that it
Right.
hurt his heart,
Mhm.
we gave it up. And I came from a family that this was not something to be taken lightly, right? So I
No.
came from that big Italian family, and my parents restored an old Victorian home.
Oh,
This
beautiful.
massive, beautiful, they were called the Painted Ladies, so
Oh goodness.
gorgeous, gorgeous home, like on the main street in our little town. And she would decorate, my mom would decorate for Christmas. And I mean, the outside, the inside, it was magazine worthy for sure. Like, and just created the most beautiful, homey, warm, just the most beautiful ambiance. Like everything about it was gorgeous and beautiful, and everybody loved going. And we did Christmas Eve with my mother's family, and so her four brothers and all of their children, and my four siblings and our family. So this was like a huge thing, right? Like a really, really, really big thing, and it was just like a staple. um so I repeated that. I that was something I did in my home too. We over the top decorated, like
Yeah.
even throw pillows on the couches, and the kids all had Christmas bed sheets that we would
Oh
switch
my
out in the
goodness.
winter. Besides the decorations, right? Like Christmas was a big deal.
Randy, I love it.
And
I love it.
so when God told us that Christmas was pagan and it was hurting his
Mhm.
heart,
Mhm.
and we stopped, my mom and sister also were on board with that. That was something we all came to at the same time. And it we were all in agreement. We were sad, but we were in agreement, right?
Right.
There was a sadness, but our
Sure.
our faith and our devotion to being Christian and to Jesus was, I mean, it was genuine. Like
Yeah.
when someone deconstructs, the first thing people tend to say is, oh, well, they weren't really a believer at all, or they weren't really
That's right.
saved, or whatever.
You just want to
um
sin.
Right. Yep.
Brandee, you just wanted to sin, right?
Right.
You preferred your life of sin rather than
Yes.
yeah,
Right. And even though, I mean, nobody's perfect, right? But
right,
we were living what we believed, to the
yeah.
best of our ability. Like, did we get in arguments and fight? And,
Well,
of course,
sure,
right? But, you wouldn't have found Disney. You wouldn't have found, nothing inappropriate, nothing,
right.
just we really did practice what we were believing and preaching.
Hmm.
So when we gave up Christmas, it was a nightmare, to be honest. My dad did not understand. I mean, like, did not understand.
Of
My
course,
in-laws did not understand. The We had some of my siblings that two of my siblings are local and live near me, and two are not. So the two that are not weren't in the middle of this, and it was like a death blow. It was this shock. Like, what? Like, we can't, Christmas is canceled, like, forever? Like, what do you mean, And my mother's brothers, and when it was just done, like something that had been, my mom was in her 50s, at the time, something that had no one had ever considered not doing this, and it was just done, and
yeah.
nobody could understand. It was very traumatic, and it wasn't handled well, but we stood on our soapboxes proudly, and we were, it was done. Obviously, Halloween wasn't hard. We weren't really
No,
involved in that.
sure,
um, we didn't do anything with Easter,
right,
either, because it was pagan. We researched the origins of these things, and
right,
so we were able to leave it behind, right? But
right.
then, so having been through, I mean, and I'm talking like tears and
Yeah,
anger, and it's
grief.
ironic, yeah, like extreme grief.
Yeah,
And when we were going through all of this, we know, everybody knows that there's a different feeling at Christmas time, right? There's
yeah.
there is
There is.
something different.
Yeah,
And because we were looking for deception, everywhere, to us that became the magic of Christmas. And we were against magic,
right.
like, you can't be a Christian and, like, think magic is okay. And so it was the magic of Christmas, and it was the spirit of Christmas, this
Right.
demonic spirit of Christmas, that was
Wow.
causing this feeling.
Yeah.
And so it all had to go away. I mean,
Sure.
it had to go away.
I get it.
And but the rift that it caused within my family and my extended family,
Mhm.
we are 9 years later, and it is not healed to this day.
Oh,
Oh my
wow.
gosh.
Um,
I'm
n-
sorry.
I mean, it's still like a really, really sore subject. It's bad.
Yeah.
Um, and I come from a family where I truly didn't think it was possible for something to divide us,
Right.
but that did. And like I said, it still has, there's still major repercussions of that. So to go back to the Yahweh piece,
Yeah.
we had been through all of these things. We stopped the pagan holidays. I posted on Facebook. I tried to get so many other Christians to wake up to the origins of where these holy days, right? Where these holy days came from,
Oh,
and to realize that they God's heart is broken because we are doing these things, whether we are doing it out of ignorance or not. It didn't matter. God's heart is broken, and you have a Bible, and you can read that Bible, and you can read exactly what I read,
oh,
and
Brandee.
we went through it all, right?
I got to interrupt you real quick because you'll get a kick out of this. I hope, but I would have argued with you on that point back in the day.
Oh, I
I
was good at arguing.
Oh, I'm sure you were. I mean, it would have been an interesting conversation at the time because I always tried to be respectful while arguing. I'm still like that, but I would have pointed out the verses people use in the Old Testament. I would explain that that's about real idols. It's not about a Christmas tree, for goodness sake. Like it would have been interesting. so I wasn't as good a Christian as you, Brandee, because I did not give up Christmas. I
you
I stuck
you
to
were
it,
still
and
under the Christmas spirit.
exactly. Anyway,
Right?
I wanted to throw that in there. I thought it was interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I went around and around. Like, I didn't. It was in a with the right heart. Okay, like when I would
Yeah.
discuss this with people
Yeah.
or argue it with people, right? It
Mhm.
truly was from a place in my heart
Oh, sure.
that
Sure.
really just wanted people to be able to see,
Mhm.
what they were doing, that they weren't
Right.
understanding. And so when the Yahweh, not for all intents and purposes, everything that I was seeing made it look like the Father Jesus was talking about was not the same character that we were reading about in the Old Testament. And so
Yeah.
we had so fully devoted our lives to living that way that it rocked our world. It wasn't just like a small thing that you could pass by. And
Mhm.
I have a nephew that he's just a really brilliant, very unique guy. And I remember when he was in 6th grade, he was at a Christian school. But he wasn't really raised reading the Bible or Christian. It was kind of a new thing for him to go to that school and be in that setting. And he was an avid reader. And I remember he read the Bible cover to cover, which was nothing for him because he would read these big thick books really fast. He's like a speed reader. And he read the entire Bible. And then he got into a discussion with his Bible teacher at school because
Uh-oh.
it was very
Oh,
clear
yeah.
to him that the God of the Old Testament, this was his words, the God of the
Yeah.
Old Testament is not the God in the New Testament.
Right.
And he got in trouble and they called his parents and his parents had to
Sure.
come into the school. And he was arguing with lots of verses from the Old Testament
Right.
that are disturbing,
Yeah.
and his parents didn't have an answer. They were, what we would have called baby Christians at the time, and they didn't
Sure.
have an answer.
Okay.
And they actually called us and said, "Can you help us? How do
Mhm.
we explain this to him?" And we couldn't really, but it kind of got tossed over to my husband more than me, but I remember the situation. And um he's now, I want to say 24, 25. So that was a long time ago. So
Yeah.
when this Yahweh thing came up, like that was like a light bulb in my mind. And I was like, "Oh, wait.
Yeah.
He saw this a long
Oh my
time ago."
goodness.
And
Yeah.
I remembered some of the verses, right?
Mhm.
So when I first started to look at the Yahweh thing, um I only knew taking the Bible literally.
Yep.
I mean, there were I could see that there were other layers. I mean, there were parables, obviously.
Mhm.
There were some things that were metaphors because we had deeply studied the different harvests. So we knew that there was the wheat harvest and the barley harvest, and there was a time to harvest the grapes and the olives,
Yeah.
and obviously we saw that there was symbology in there. there
Sure.
there were there was lots of things that we saw that we took literally, and we knew there was another symbolic layer. But when we started when I first started to try to unpack, like, how do I figure out who Yahweh really is,
Yeah.
the only thing I really knew to do was, okay, now I got to go back and read the entire Bible again
Yeah.
and figure out what parts are the actual God and what parts are this
Yep.
Satan who is playing God. I
They're
didn't I
they're
didn't know how else to do it.
right.
And
They're both in there, Brandee, as you
yeah.
know. They're both in there. The people consider the Melchizedek religion, or the Melchizedek
Mhm.
branch, which is El Elyon, or what a lot of people consider Father God, and then Yahweh being a secondary god that was given the Hebrew people. I mean, this is all stuff you
Mhm.
know, but there may
Yeah.
be people that don't know this. But anyway, it's all in there. So you're going back into the Old Testament and reading it again, and there's two Genesis stories,
Right.
very
Yeah.
different. One's very patriarchal and puts women in a certain place, and the other one is they were both created at the same time, and they were given dominion over the earth. Very, very different tales all throughout the Old Testament, but a clear winner comes forward if you're looking at who is bloodthirsty and vengeful and jealous and all of that. But anyway, I don't want to interrupt you too
Right.
much, but there you go.
Well, it was a daunting task,
Yeah,
right? Because I, in my ignorance and in my trauma, I thought, well, this will be easy because we have the litmus test. The
yeah,
enemy came to steal, kill, and destroy. So
yes,
if this anywhere that I see stealing, killing, or destroying clearly
yes.
is not
Oh my
the
gosh,
Father
you're so
that
good.
Jesus was talking about, right?
Yep.
So that was
Yeah.
my litmus test because
Okay.
Scripture interprets Scripture, and you don't
Mm.
need to go outside of Scripture whatsoever to
Right.
understand Scripture. And I was very well versed in all those things, and I had my rules, and I followed the rules.
Okay.
So and I started over looking at it, and it wasn't that simple, right?
Sure.
It wasn't that simple, but everything in me knew that as a just as a human, as a woman, as a
Hmm.
mom, especially as a mom, right? And
Hmm.
I have two boys and four girls, and as a parent raising four daughters,
Hmm.
there was so many disturbing parts of the Bible.
Yeah.
And and not coming from a place of like women's liberation or being liberal or none of that, right?
Right.
But just if if my daughter is raped, you still have to marry her.
Yeah.
The seven God wanting 72 virgins as the
Uh-huh.
spoils of
Right.
war. And and I'm thinking at the time my daughters were like at 11, 12, and then the other ones were younger, and knowing that these girls that God commanded them to kill every man, woman, and child and
Yes.
animal, and
Yeah.
but keep 72 virgins after you
Yes.
murder their families in front
Yep.
of them and
Yeah.
then bring them back to me. And so I'm picturing my 11, 12, 13-year
Oh.
old daughter
Oh gosh.
who I mean, what?
Yeah.
How can I make sense of that? And at the same time, it was there were so many things that happened like sequentially or all at the same time. A family who did the home fellowship with us, they were really good about sitting down and reading the Bible out loud as a family.
Hmm.
And I think their oldest was around 12 at the time. And they sat down one night and they would take turns reading, and each one would read a few paragraphs. And I remember her coming to me and saying, "Yeah, well, we were reading about Elisha last night."
Uh-huh.
And so her husband had been an unbeliever. And so he would sit there with them, but that's how they were trying to convert him,
Hmm.
was like, you're the dad, and he was willing to be part of it, but he wasn't buying it, right?
Right.
And so that night they sat down and they were reading about Elisha, and it was and I'm sorry, I can't remember the chapter and verse, but
That's
where
okay.
the kids were picking on him and calling him bald head.
Yeah.
And then God sent a bear out, and the bear
Hmm.
mauled 40 children and killed them because
Hmm.
they were calling an adult man bald head.
Yeah.
And the kids, and they all just were like, "Oh, wait, what what do we
Yeah.
do with
What
this?"
just happened? Yeah.
And they're deep in the programming,
Yep.
but their dad wasn't. And he was like, "What? Wait, what? Read that again?" Like he
Yeah.
was like stunned because he just didn't know any of this
Right.
kind of stuff was in the Bible. And there was just like examples of that happening over and over and over as
Mhm.
we were, because like most Christians, we had read the New Testament,
Right.
but we weren't as versed in the Old Testament. And
Right.
as we became more versed in it, these things just became really obvious and really disturbing.
It's painful
So,
a little bit,
yeah.
Brandee. At least it was for me. I mean, these things. Here's the thing: these things have always been in there, right? And as a believer, you've sat in hundreds, thousands of church services, and you read from the Old Testament, and it just never hits you the same way. And atheists have been pointing out these verses. The problem with slavery in the Old Testament, the problem with,
Yes.
as you mentioned, human sacrifice. There's at least one story in the Bible where that general said, "If Yahweh gives me this victory, when I get home, I'll sacrifice the first thing that meets me at the door," and it was his own daughter.
Yes.
And he followed through with that. And there's all these arguments from Christians. Oh, well, slavery's you have to understand that they when they won in a battle, when Israel won in a battle, these virgins that were left, and their husbands killed, and all of that, they wouldn't have been able to take care of themselves out in the wild on their own. So Yahweh was doing them a favor. He was caring for them by making them marry Jewish soldiers and being their quote unquote slave wife. I mean, there's all these excuses,
Yeah.
but it is painfully obvious when
Right.
the veil is lifted and you're able to see all of that. And then all those verses come rushing back to you that atheists argued against and tried to point out for decades and decades, and now they make sense. Um,
Right.
but it's still painful. At least it was for me.
Yeah. And I was very much, well, between cognitive dissonance and confirmation bias. I had never
Yep.
listened to atheists. I didn't know the
Right.
arguments. I didn't even know the arguments.
Right.
So it wasn't, I was sheltered in that sense because I I believed what I believed and I was going deeper into that belief, but I wasn't aware of anything that challenged it.
Hmm.
I really wasn't.
That makes sense.
So and even just the concept of not taking the Bible literally,
Hmm.
that was sacrilege to me.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, it was sacrilege.
It's the word of God,
Um,
Randy.
right.
It's the
Right.
inerrant word of God.
And I also, I think one thing that was good is like not really growing up in the Christian environment that
Right.
my husband did, and so many of the people that I was in community with. Nobody told me like how dangerous it was to read the Apocrypha or the Book of Enoch
Right?
or Jasher or Jubilee. I didn't know that was dangerous. So I read them.
Yeah, you did.
And so I read those, and I read the entire Apocrypha.
Yeah.
And um I didn't I didn't understand it, of course. Like I could only assume that that was also to be taken literally. And then
Mhm.
I can remember at our home fellowship laughing because I think it's in the book of Jasher. There's a story where the mighty warriors are picking up boulders and crushing them between their butt cheeks. And we were like, and we would just laugh, because we were still taking it literally, but we were like,
Yeah.
how does this work? And the kids thought that was hilarious, right?
Sure they did.
So, but I did read the Apocrypha, and
Hmm.
I was of the opinion that, well, I knew it was originally included in the original canon that the Roman Catholic Church had put together. It wasn't until later that it was taken out. So I felt like it was fair game. And then when we had our home fellowship, where it was mostly people who had been raised in church or in conservative Christian communities their entire lives, they were actually very leery of even reading the Apocrypha because it had just been so ingrained in them that
Hmm.
that's dangerous. You don't do that, right? I didn't have that, so at least I read it. So
Right.
um and it was, there was fascinating, but it gave me a broader view of some of these things. And
Sure.
I felt like, honestly, it backed up the Bible.
Right.
It solidified a lot of the things, like the Nephilim and the fallen
Yeah.
angels and all kinds of things. Like it
It
solidified those, right?
it fills in a lot of missing parts
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
the Old Testament doesn't fill in.
But
It
we
makes it
were
more
all,
understandable.
yes, it does. But so when we had decided, if we back up a couple of years, when we had come out of that NAR deception, and we decided the best way to never be deceived again was to know the Bible really, really
Right.
well. We started in Genesis as a group, like a whole bunch of us. And just because of, I guess, just how I'm wired, I
Uh-huh.
was the one saying, well, wait a minute, because we were reading it with a fine tooth comb now, right?
Sure.
We weren't just skimming over the stories, and it wasn't Sunday school.
Right.
And so things were standing out. Like if um if Cain had already killed Abel, and but then Cain was banished and he was sent to the land of Nod, which was east of Eden,
Yeah.
where he found a wife and he built a city.
Right.
It was just seemed really obvious. Well, where did his wife come from and who was in his city?
Yeah.
Like, things
Yeah.
like that, right? That
These were
that
all Adam's children, Adam and Eve's other children, right? Yeah. No.
Right, right.
No.
There were just so many things like that. Or when we see in Genesis when God put the mark on Cain so that
Yeah.
nobody would kill him. Well,
Yeah.
who was going to kill him? It would have been his own siblings, and they would have known the
Right.
story. And
Sure.
there were just so many things that, as we went through it with a fine-tooth comb, that and it did tend to be me. I admit, I have always been like that, and
Yeah.
I would bring those things up, and everyone, we would just sit there and we were like, we don't know, like,
Right.
okay, good question. Now they could see it, but we don't
Right.
have an answer. And how do
Right.
we get the answer? We didn't know. We didn't know how to get the answer.
Right.
But as we went through with the fine tooth comb, like
Mhm.
we just came across that over and over and over again, where it just didn't make sense.
Right.
I love sciencey things. I like genetics,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and I remember just everybody being slightly annoyed at me because there were certain things I just couldn't let go.
Right.
And I just could not wrap my brain around the fact that if there were 8 souls left alive after the flood,
Mhm.
and Noah and his wife had 3 sons, and we don't believe in evolution,
Right.
then how do we get the deepest black brown pigments in
Right.
people in this part of the world, and like blonde hair blue-eyed people in this part of the world, and
Sure.
Asian features in that part of the world? If you believe in millions of years and evolution, then I suppose that that's a possibility
Sure.
with three, coming from 3 siblings, right, from three
Yeah.
brothers, maybe, right?
Maybe.
But you know, I couldn't let things like that go. It just
Right.
didn't make any sense to me. And I
Mhm.
love to look at people. I'm a people watcher.
Yeah.
And so I love
Yep.
looking at like similarities and features and coloring and just all the
Mhm.
genetic things,
Yeah.
and none of it made sense.
Right.
And so I guess, as I'm sorry to get off the Yahweh topic, but
No, but go ahead
as
and move forward. So, where was your faith at this time, Brandee, when you were looking at the Yahweh stuff? And let's kind of use that as a springboard to move
Okay, yeah,
forward
so
to
that's a
what
good
happened.
question. So I actually said out loud to my husband more than once that, um even though I was seeing that it was very likely that the God of the Old Testament was not the God of the New Testament, just
There we
like my
go.
nephew had said all those years
Yeah.
ago, um I expressly stated, Jesus is in this little box and I'm
Yeah.
not touching him.
Yeah.
Like that
Oh,
does not change.
right.
All of this can be reframed,
Right.
but Jesus stays in the box.
Sure.
And I had decided that. You know what I mean?
Okay.
It wasn't
Yeah.
even like, because it just was that important. It really was that important. So my faith had not been shaken. I think in certain ways my faith had been strengthened because that spirit of truth had shown me something
Right.
that millions of other people were not seeing. Now, I certainly wasn't the only one, because
No.
when I started to actually look at it, I started to find that there were other people that were seeing this, and a couple people I found on YouTube, and
Yep.
different things. So I wasn't the
Yeah.
only one, but I
No.
didn't I didn't come across it that way.
Right.
It wasn't like I stumbled upon a YouTube video. This was
Right.
something that, like I shared earlier, I knew when I was reading the Bible alone in my own house that something wasn't right. So I've been accused of being blown by every wind of doctrine,
Oh,
and
sure.
people assuming that, I'm just scrolling through YouTube and I'm like, oh, this looks good, I'll believe this today. Well,
Right.
Not
Not the way it works.
nobody who does that, like, who
I don't know.
builds their entire life on a belief system and then watches one random video and is like, okay, I'll throw it all away, right? Like,
Mhm.
nobody does. Well, I don't do that. Maybe somebody does, but I
Sure.
don't do that. So my faith was actually stronger in a way
Okay.
because I felt like Jesus was very much protecting us.
Right.
Like, we could see something that other people couldn't see, and it was like the ultimate deception
Okay.
right under our noses, right?
Yeah.
So and then I mean, there were a lot of other things along the way. It was a very emotional time, and
Yeah.
when I say PTSD, like, I'm not joking about that.
No.
Like, it
No.
shook us to our very core,
Mm-hmm.
and we didn't really know where to go. And when I say we, it's my husband and I,
Yeah.
and a handful of friends who were also part of our home fellowship, but there were a few of us that we all homeschooled our children. And
Uh-huh.
so we got together a lot, at the playground or someone's house or whatever. So we were together a lot, and we were always talking about these things.
Sure.
And so there was a few of us that were regularly discussing these things, like, as it was unfolding.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember feeling so supported and so blessed, because especially the two women that I was closest with, when I brought it up to them, I really didn't know if it was going to be like blasphemy or,
Right.
okay, I hear you. And they did say, I hear you. And they
Oh,
they
good.
they had been, the way I looked at it, the way I processed it at the time, was they had been prepared. So God prepared them to hear it.
Right.
And maybe that is how it works. I don't know. But I remember at the very same time, this was not like all just academic study.
No.
This wasn't like Googling and watching YouTube and that
Mm-hmm.
kind of thing. Two women that I was very close with, one had a 12-year-old son who had been diagnosed with Lyme disease, and he went from being an athlete and playing all-star baseball to 9 months later having to be actually carried by his pregnant mom and sat
Oh,
on the toilet and carried to the bed and carried to the
no.
pool, and couldn't even walk. I mean, he was completely debilitated with the Lyme. And at the very same time, another dear friend had a 2-year-old that needed a bone marrow transplant or he was going to die.
Mm-hmm.
And we were, as a Christian community, our all of us were fasting
Yeah.
on a regular basis and praying the most heartfelt prayers. I mean, we were praying as if it was our own children, because
Yeah.
we were really close,
Of
and
course.
we absolutely believed that God answers prayers. So we fasted and prayed and fasted and prayed. And um and I remember talking to the one mom, the mom of the 12-year-old boy, on the phone one day, and she was crying, and she just said, I heard him in his room last night, just crying, sobbing, and crying out to God and saying,
Yeah.
what am I doing wrong? Do I not have enough faith? Why won't you heal
Oh,
me? And, this 12-year-old boy who doesn't wear his heart on his sleeve. And she
Right.
heard all of it, and she
Uh,
was crying and sobbing, and I was crying, and I wanted to know why,
yeah.
why is he not being healed? And this, the other family, just they'd done everything right, and now the
Yeah.
2-year-old needs a bone marrow transplant or he's gonna die.
Oh,
And so my paradigm was in limbo, right? At
right.
that point. I was angry and I
Hmm.
was confused and I knew it just didn't work. And that same day I drive, at the time I drove a Suburban. We have 6 kids. I have this giant
Yeah.
car, and I do not like to parallel park a Suburban. So when we would meet my grandmother every Tuesday for lunch, and we would go to this little coffee place, and it's right on a main street, and you either have to find a side street to park on, or because I can't parallel park this thing, right? So
Okay.
I
Yeah.
remember driving there that day, and this was it was stupid, but it was a really pivotal moment for me.
Okay.
I was
Right.
driving, I was maybe 2 or 3 minutes away from there, and in my mind, I just said this quick prayer, like, boy, it'd be really nice if the end 2 parking spots were open so I could just pull right in.
Yeah.
And, it was cold out. And so, a couple minutes later, we get there, and the end 2 parking spots were open.
Oh,
And
miracle.
so I pulled in, and in my perfect programming, I
Yep.
said that little prayer in my heart, like, thank you, God, so much. Like, that was so cool that
Mhm.
you made these spots for me.
Right.
And then I had that thought, well, wait a minute. Like, if I was an atheist, I would say that was really good luck.
Right.
And if I believed in karma, I would be saying, wow, that was like really good karma.
Yeah.
And I went through all these scenarios in my head, and then I was like, okay, in the real world, I don't think that God heard my prayer. And so we're talking, like, I prayed this prayer like 3 minutes before I pulled in,
Sure.
not an hour. So
Right.
in the real world, I was like, well, I don't think that God heard my prayer, and then whoever was eating their sandwich was like, oh, I have to be done right now. Brandy's got to pull in. I've got to go out and move my car because she prayed and she gets that spot.
Yeah.
So I said this, my paradigm was shifting, and I was like, okay, the last 2 people that were parked there were done doing whatever they were doing, and they got in their cars and they left.
Yeah.
And that's when, like, the programming really started to break, because
Okay.
it was just like really obvious that there's another way of looking at this.
Yeah.
And I don't know, to me it was kind of earth shattering, even though it
Yeah.
sounds so silly. It was just all of a sudden like, wait a minute, like, there's another way to see this.
Yeah. No, I
You
don't
know?
think it's silly at all. I think sometimes what the little things that seem silly are the biggest things to us to help break the
Absolutely.
Yeah.
programming. And about how long ago was this, and how quickly did it progress to? I mean, not to where you are now, because I know there's a
Mhm.
lot to that.
This was about 3 to 3.5 years ago.
Okay,
Yeah.
perfect, perfect.
Yeah.
So where did you go
Well,
from there, Brandy? And I'm
so
not trying to rush you, but I do want to leave some room for questions, and I know we could talk all night about all of this, but um, yeah, maybe like 15 more minutes if you can do that,
okay,
Brandy.
sure. So I guess, in the whole overall discussion of deconstruction,
Hmm.
is that I realized, like, that began the paradigm shift, and
Okay.
I took what I had learned in natural health,
Hmm.
and coming out of just, believing whatever a doctor says, whatever the magazine says, or the media, or, whatever.
Right.
I had already deconstructed
Right.
in many other areas of my life. My
Yeah.
paradigms in other areas had already shifted. I was a pro at that, right?
That makes
But
sense. That
but
makes sense.
the cognitive dissonance when it came to my faith and Christianity was a whole different ball game.
Hmm.
Just very, very different. So when it was very much a process, of, I mean, I remember just making a very concerted effort to say, I have to start over. Like, I'm going to take each and every belief
Yeah.
and I'm going to examine it and I'm going to look it up.
Okay.
And one of the ways we happen to be, we homeschool, and we came across something that we were looking at, and it was an origin story, and it had to do with Hawaiian people.
Oh.
So, but we ended up, that led me to like looking at other origin stories. I
Yep.
got on this kick of looking at origin stories.
Yeah, me
And
too.
as I did that, I stumbled onto like the Sumerian
Yep.
text, the cuneiform tablets, the Enuma Elish,
Mm-hmm.
the Atrahasis, and so, but I was just looking at that as, oh, it's just another origin story. I was
Right.
looking at people all around the world and their origin stories.
Yep.
But when I started to read the Sumerian and Akkadian
Yep.
origin stories, it was, that blew the top off everything, because even though the names were different and some of the details were different, I very much recognized that those were the stories that were in the Bible.
Yeah.
There was just no question. And
Yeah.
that was disturbing.
Yeah.
That was another layer of, oh my goodness.
Yeah, what the heck?
What have I been believing, right? So, in certain ways it was just information. It was things I had never looked at. They just,
Right.
I couldn't make an informed decision because I had never looked at these things.
Uh-huh.
And so there was more things that I was looking at. And at the same time, my paradigm had shifted to where I thought I need to have an open enough mind
Mm-hmm.
to look at these things. It shouldn't be scary
No.
to just look at things.
No.
It shouldn't be, it just shouldn't be scary. And
No.
I also, I'm the type of parent that, and so my husband, that there's not one single question that I could even think of that if my children came to me with this certain question,
Ooh.
that it was, and they genuinely wanted an answer,
Right.
that I would be angry. And
Right.
I just wouldn't be angry. I would say, I would do my best to answer them,
Yeah.
and I looked at God that way, that if, if he loved us the way that Jesus says he does,
Uh-huh.
then he's not going to look at me as some rebellious, naughty child. He
Right.
gave me this curiosity. He
Yes.
gave me this kind of wiring, and he's going to be okay if I ask these
He's
questions.
gonna be
And,
okay. Yeah.
and that's kind of how I set out. So I really just went belief by belief as they came up.
Okay.
And, sometimes it was, well, a lot of times it was out on a walk. That's my quiet time. And I
Yeah.
would be out on a walk thinking of things, and, and then I'd get my next question and I'd say,
Mhm.
okay, now I need to examine this. Like, is there
Yeah.
any truth in this? Is there any evidence? Like, does this
Yeah.
hold water? And so it was very systematically, I just walked through belief by belief by belief. And I was open-minded enough to look at many potential ways of understanding those things.
Yeah.
Whereas before, with my confirmation bias, I only looked in certain boxes,
Right.
and I was never able to go outside those boxes because that was too uncomfortable.
Well, yeah, not just that, Brandy. I'll add to that. Yes,
Mhm.
uncomfortable, but also we're not allowed to do that. I mean, you're told not to look at origin stories. You're told not to
Yeah.
look at other religions. You're told, I mean, you can look at another religion if you're trying to see how to refute it with Christianity, but
Right.
there's this stigma about looking at anything other than the Bible that is prevalent, as far as I know, throughout the whole of Christianity. So yeah, of course you're not supposed to look
Yeah.
into these other things because and New Age things, of course. Look at anything New Age. I mean, that was my thing. I still struggle with it, Brandy. Some of the more wackier, like channeling.
Yes.
I was
Right.
telling Jen, I
Right.
still have an issue with channeling. It's like like someone says, "Oh, I'm channeling the spirit of Mary Magdalene." I'm like, "Oh, well, that's convenient." Or
Yeah.
Cleopatra with reincarnation. Well, there can only be one spirit of Cleopatra, but yet so many people say that they were Cleopatra in the past life. Well, it can't be everyone. So it's
Right.
things like that that I still kind of like, yeah, I'm not sure about that. But yeah, we're
Yeah.
told, the point is we're told not to look at these things. And I like that you said that you had to come at it with an open mind. And also I like the point you said about curiosity, that that's the way God made us. From that perspective, we're given the curiosity, the very curiosity that set us free from the bonds of the box of Christianity in the first place. It's just so interesting.
Right. Right. And and it's funny because the people who who have told me to my face how much they respect my ability to research,
Yeah.
and that I'm that the length that I go to find the truth, like let's
Yep.
say about vaccines or about something with natural health or whatever.
Yeah.
And they'll praise me for how, and they'll, I mean, you're so brilliant in this and you retain it, and they just praise me up and down. But
Yeah.
then all of a sudden when it comes to with Christianity, like my brain
Yes.
fell out of my head and I
Sure.
just believe whatever. It's like,
Sure.
wait
Sure.
a minute, do you think I applied less of my intelligence to researching something that I've built my entire life on, than I did on
Yeah.
what supplement to take, right?
Right.
So that always that still amazes me,
Yeah, it does.
because I I I researched it in the same way as far as
Right.
the history and the things that are that are intellectual
Hmm.
information, right?
Hmm.
And and honestly, that you can go in circles with that too.
Sure.
Like, I'm not dumb.
No.
This is not out of ignorance. Like, lots of different people have lots of different agendas and they write a lot of things.
Right.
So I don't read anything and
Yeah.
automatically think this is truth. This
Of
must be
course.
truth because of whatever. So my approach has been more getting in touch with the intuitive side of me, which
Yeah.
I do believe is the Holy Spirit,
Yeah.
right?
Me too.
So
Yeah.
there is a knowing within us, and I have a litmus test for that too, and it
Yeah.
is love. It is love.
Yes.
And
There it is.
that is so simple a child can understand it.
There it is.
And nobody needs
Mhm.
a list, and nobody needs a book, and
No.
nobody needs a doctrine or a degree in theology or
Yeah.
any of those things. I am raising 6 children, and no
Hmm.
matter what their ages, they understand that language. Is this loving towards yourself or another person
Right.
or an animal or the
Wow.
earth or whatever, right? But it's very simple,
Yeah.
that litmus test.
It still is, in my opinion, the most important thing about this life is loving yourself,
Hmm.
loving others, and being in that place. It is something that you can hold on to. It is something you can cling to. That's better than any book or any
Right.
religion or anything like that. And that's where I'm at with it.
And I seem to remember somebody named Jesus
Yeah.
telling us that, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's right there. I
It
mean,
is.
it's not inferred. He said it. And the
He,
greatest is love, right? I mean,
yeah.
it's there.
Yeah.
And so it just got so simple. And it's interesting because, like, when you say I didn't even know the atheist arguments, like
Yeah.
I really truly didn't know the atheist arguments, but I am not an atheist because in
No.
the truest sense of that word, it would be anti-theist.
Right.
And I don't believe in any theology at this
Yeah.
point. I mean, I
Sure.
think there's not a theology anywhere around that we can't trace back to a certain time in history with human origins.
That's true. Yeah.
So in that sense, I guess I would be an atheist because I'm anti-theism.
Yeah.
But I have also had the immense miraculous experience
Mm.
of growing 6 human beings inside my body and bringing
Yeah.
them into this world and watching them grow as
Hmm.
individual souls, individual human beings.
Yeah.
And so this journey did not take me into a place where a place that is godless,
Right. No.
but it did
No.
take me to a place without theology and doctrine and books and pastors and teachers and
Yeah.
tithing and money and greed and power and all of the systems that have grown out of religion.
Yeah.
That so
The cage is open flying. I mean, that's
right.
beautiful. I've always liked that title. So, just to put a capper on this, and then I'd like to
Mhm.
ask some questions. So, I think the way you ended that last part was just beautiful. It to me, it is about love and it is about curiosity. Those are the two main things that really stuck with me about where you're at and how you've gotten to this place. Um, so would you say so 3.5 years ago you said when the Yahweh stuff happened, and then looking at the origin stories, was there ever a moment, or was it more gradual? I'll say for me the Yahweh thing was big, and there were the things about hell that were big, and rapture and all that stuff that I looked at before it came to that point. And then I also used Jesus's words to cross reference to the Old Testament, and it was a big deal to me when I would see that constantly. When he was arguing with the Pharisees, he would say, "You're of your father, the devil." Well, who was their father? Well,
Right.
it was Yahweh. There's some pretty clear things that Jesus said, so there was a lot in that for me, and he was changing the Old Testament scriptures. You've heard it said an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, but I tell you, I mean, he
Yeah.
was changing it, and people don't realize that. They think, well,
Matthew 5,
yeah,
the whole beginning of that is him
yeah,
calling it out.
yeah, he's calling
Yeah.
it out, and he's saying, and the other thing you mentioned, Elisha. So at one point they had come to a town. I believe it was Philip and John. I could be wrong about that, so forgive me if I don't remember the two other characters. But they came to a town when they were doing their ministry, walking with Jesus, and the town rejected him. And one of them turned to Jesus and says, "You want us to call down fire like Elijah?" And he said, "You don't know what spirit you're of."
Right.
Blew my mind. I'm like, I've read it before. I'd read it many times before, but I didn't see it. I didn't see
Yes.
it
Yeah.
because of the veil. But then I saw it when your mind is open to it, and you allow your curiosity to lead the way for you a little bit, and a little bit of common sense, in my opinion, too. And as you said, not taking everything so literally, but it just blows my mind that it's all there. It is all there. I mean, I believe the Bible to be a very much a mixture of truth amongst lots of deception. There must be some kind of rule, Brandee, that they have to tell us what they're doing. There has to be some kind of truth out there, and maybe it's plausible deniability in the end. So when everyone figures this out and they get mad, they can say, "Well, it was there the whole time. Why didn't you see it?"
Yeah.
I don't know. That's a topic for another time,
Yeah.
perhaps. Um, do you have a way that it ended for you? And then I want to ask some questions and talk about, was there a moment that you realized that, hey, I just don't believe all this stuff anymore? Did that happen, or was it more gradual like it was for me?
Well, I think there's a few things that come to mind like immediately. The one pivotal moment was I believed wholeheartedly that I was saved and that I had put my faith in Jesus
Right.
Christ. I believed the gospel
Hmm.
wholeheartedly. And so going along with that, is there any question that I could ask God that he would be mad or disown me or, cast me into hell? Um, I knew I got to a place where I was obsessed with it. Like I was reading the Bible and looking at stuff all the time, trying to figure this out. And it was exhausting. And I felt like I was going in circles.
Yeah.
And so I remember very clearly one day I was like, okay, God, it's just you and me. I'm going to put the book away. And I want you to treat me like I'm on a deserted island. There's no churches, there's no pastors, there's no YouTube, there's nothing. It's me and you. I came into this world with nothing and I'm going to leave with nothing.
Right.
So if I'm saved, if you're real, if the Holy Spirit's real, then let me exercise these muscles that and see if I can hear you.
Hmm.
And I challenged God, honestly.
Hmm.
And I put the Bible away. And I mean, like, I did not open it. And
Right.
I don't even know, I can't remember now. Like, it was a long time, probably a year. And it was just breakthrough after breakthrough after breakthrough when I did that,
Oh,
because
wow.
it was like, nobody needs a book.
No.
I guess to me, I just got to that place where I was like, I do have a choice. If free will is real and we really do have a choice, then I have a choice to choose to believe in a God or a certain God
Right.
of my own volition. And everything in me fought against worshiping a God that murders millions of innocent people, including
Yeah.
babies. That,
Yeah.
I don't even want to get this video flagged, but slitting open the womb, the stomach of pregnant mothers and letting the baby spill out and dashing
Yeah.
babies against the stones, and it goes on and on and on. If you're taking those verses literally, and we are told within Roman Christianity that that is what
Yeah.
we are supposed to do.
Exactly.
So everything in me got to the place of courage where, if this is the only God, I don't choose him.
That's it.
I just don't choose him. Because if there was if my husband did these things, he'd be a
Mhm.
monster. And if we had a political leader or a dictator that did these things, he'd be a monster.
Yep.
And I wouldn't respect him, and I wouldn't worship him, and I wouldn't follow him, and
Right.
it just got so clear. So I just, that was a pivotal moment for me, is like, okay, if this is the God that you have to follow to be saved, I'll take my chances,
That's
because
it.
everything in my heart says this is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was easy for me.
Brandee, we came to the same conclusion. I've told Jen, and
Mm,
this was interesting to hear it come out of my own mouth, but I've told Jen, if we're wrong about Yahweh, and Yahweh is the supreme God of all being, time,
mhm.
space, and dimension, and I'm wrong, and I get sent to hell, then I'll take it.
Yeah, I
Um,
understand. I get that.
because I'm banking on that, that Father God, in my opinion, or universe, or whatever word you want to, whatever label you want to put on the creative force that I believe does exist, and the part
Hmm.
of us that does have the whole, whether you call it the Holy Spirit or just the life that's in us, each of us humans, not just believers, but all people. And you haven't met Glenn yet, but I learned a lot by spending time around Glenn, who, I mean, everything seems like a label to me, and I don't want to just say, well, he's an atheist, because he's a lot more than that.
Hmm.
He is listening, though, and maybe he'll have a question for you as we wind up. But I had always been told, well, don't be unequally yoked with unbelievers. And when I invited Glenn to be a part of the show, I took a lot of flack from my quote unquote Christian friends and said, why are you doing that? He's an atheist. You have other believers on the broadcast. And I said, I don't want this to be one sided. And honestly, Brandee, for a while, it still was one sided. He would, and poor Glenn, he's surrounded by panels of believers, and he really held his own. But what I saw in Glenn, being a professing atheist, I saw more love and kindness and caring for other
Patience.
people, patience in him than I saw in a lot of professing believers. And it really changed. It helped me see that there is, in my opinion, a little part of God in all of us, little fractals of God.
Hmm.
And you don't need to confess that you're a sinner. You don't need to worship a vengeful, jealous, angry God to get to that point. And that was a big moment for me. And it really changed everything. So now I see people differently than I ever have before, and I see the little piece of God that's in everyone, regardless of what their beliefs are. Your beliefs don't dictate, in my opinion, totally dictate who you are as a person. I mean, they're a part of people for sure, and my beliefs were a part of me for a long time. But then when I realized that I had been wrong about a lot of things and I had been deceived, as you were saying, looking at it from another perspective, it just is. I don't cling so tightly to my quote unquote beliefs. I know that I could be wrong about things I currently believe. I want to be open. I want to be curious. I want to continue to study and learn and grow and change as a person. And it's just a far better in examining myself before and who I was. I mean, I always was curious. I always was trying to be loving and all the things that a Christian wants to be. But I have that more now in abundance than I did before when I let all that religion stuff go.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
The same here. And I think of in him we live and move and have our being.
Yeah.
And we use him, and things have been personified, and you can go a long ways with those things, but
Yeah.
something animates us.
Yeah.
Something makes us alive.
Yep.
Something allows us to even comprehend love.
Yeah.
And so even though I don't ascribe to any theology,
Right.
I very much understand in a completely different light what Jesus was presenting, what
Yeah.
little we have, like in the Bible, right? And I
Yeah.
think that just when you boil it down to that place that is so simple a child can understand it,
Mm.
the rest of the fullness of the teachings of Jesus, it's in our hearts. We have access
Yeah.
to that.
Absolutely.
We don't need it in words, we don't need it in writing. We just experience it.
Yeah.
And like you said, with loving people, I can remember, I think it was at least a year, if not a year and a half into this deconstruction journey. We were at an amusement park, and it was really hot, like almost 100 degrees.
Mm-hmm.
And so everybody was like in the tiniest clothing, and there's water rides, so people were in like bikinis and stuff.
Sure.
And I remember, so I am not in any way standing in judgment of tattoos or anything,
Right.
but we've all seen tattoos where you think, what were you thinking? Right? Like, what on earth were you thinking?
Sure.
And we, in years prior, we had just noticed how many like seemingly dark and just dark tattoos that were seemed evil and just yucky, right?
Yeah.
And so that it was, and yes, like when I would see those, I would have thoughts of like, oh, that person is so lost, or they need Jesus, or something like that, right?
Sure.
And so we spent the whole day at the amusement park, and on the way home, I said to Keith that I had just realized that something in me had changed, because
Yeah.
all day long I saw those types of tattoos on people,
Yeah.
and there was zero judgment. My immediate thought and what my heart felt was,
Yeah.
what have you been through
Isn't it wonderful?
that you would put that on your body, right?
Yeah.
I had compassion.
Yeah.
Like, I felt like I wanted to hug them, and I wanted to make it okay.
It's
And
sobering.
yeah, and I didn't know how judgmental I had been in the
Yeah.
past. I didn't
Yeah.
even it wasn't compassion, it was judgment.
Yeah.
And that day, and he said, "Oh my goodness, I felt the same way." Where he just looked at people without even knowing it. Our hearts had changed, and I have brought this up to the children several times, because the movie The Grinch, the Grinch Who Stole
Mhm.
Christmas. The whole point of the movie is when Cindy Lou Who showed him love, and it was the only thing that could bring him back into the fold. It was the
Yep.
only thing that could change him, and his heart grew 8 sizes in one day.
Yep.
And that was how we didn't even know that was happening.
Yeah.
We didn't, and
Wow.
it's still happening. Like, we see it, and we see it in our children. And
Yeah.
so if someone's going to tell me that deconstructing from a religion has destroyed my family or made us worse
Yeah.
off, I see the opposite.
Sure.
I see the compassion, I see the love,
Beautiful.
and yeah, it's
Brandee,
amazing.
yeah, it is amazing. I'm glad you shared that. Glenn has a question, so you can look at the chat if you want to, or I can read it to you, or both. Either way.
Because I don't know how to see it.
Okay, that's okay. Glenn asks, rather than religion being the quote problem, unquote, is it not people who use religion as an excuse to not act out of love and respect towards others in the world that are the problem?
Hmm.
What do you think of that?
Honestly, I would say both,
Yeah.
because certainly the second part of that, it's the people not acting,
Right.
in that way. But I do, having so deeply researched the history of religions, and
Mhm.
especially the history of what we call the church, going back to Roman Catholicism and Constantine, and when Imperial Rome put on its disguise and became the Roman Catholic Church and disseminated what we have now, um, that was done on purpose.
Yeah.
That was done for a very specific reason. And I think when I've traced so I don't look at I'm not looking at studying other religions necessarily, like, oh, I want to see what they believe so I can
Right.
see if I want to be this flavor.
Right.
I studied them looking back at the origins and how they
Uh-huh.
evolved and how they developed and
Yep.
who was involved and why and where have they ended up. And
Yeah.
all of them
Yeah.
have slivers of truth, or nobody
Yep.
would be fooled, right?
Correct.
It's there in
Yeah.
some degree or another. But the main religions that we know now are all, like, you could maybe say the equivalent of a CIA psyop,
I agree
because they
completely.
were molded and shaped and
Yep.
very much to make sure people do not understand what they are. Not who they
Yeah.
are, but what they are.
Yeah.
And Jesus
Exactly.
was telling us what we are in the eyes of God, in the eyes of the Creator. And the
Yep.
religions are telling us the opposite.
Exactly. Thank you, Brandee. Glenn then asks, can you elaborate on where you are now with your beliefs? Thanks.
Sure. So it took me quite a while to deconstruct, but at the same time, I also knew that that would be a short season, because what good is it to dive so deep into what I don't believe, and why?
Uh-huh.
All of the questions still remained. What am I? Who am I? Why am I here? Why, like, what is this life about?
Right.
What is this?
Right.
And honestly, I know very solidly what I do not believe, and I can
Right.
tell you exactly why.
Yeah.
My understanding of what I do believe, I would say, to some degree, is fluid,
Mhm.
because it just gets deeper and deeper every single day. Every experience, every
Yeah.
interaction, every every prayer,
Mhm.
every moment alone, every walk that I take up in the woods, there's
Oh, yeah.
something that deepens my understanding of those big questions.
Yeah.
And so I don't ever see an end to
I
that.
don't either.
So I am not an atheist in that sense of
Right.
not believing that there's any type of intelligent design.
Right.
I can't go there, because I've given birth to 6 babies. So just
Sure.
that alone. Um, but I, as far as like the Bible part of it, I think that's one of the things that I still have such a deep desire to understand. What
Yeah.
is this book? What is this? Like,
Mhm.
um, and I have come across, I would say 7 or 8 different layers
Mhm.
that are found in the Bible, that are the esoteric or hidden
Yeah.
meanings. Just like there was hidden meaning in the parables, Jesus did not speak it in plain words. He hid
Right.
it in a parable.
Right.
And so I see the Bible has these layers that are unbelievably deep and
Yep.
beautiful and
Mhm.
helpful. Um, but they are not the exoteric that Rome
Right.
used to get us to take these things literally and
Yep.
create a religion of hate based on a book about love.
Oh, that's beautiful.
So I still very much am a student of the Bible
Mhm.
in that sense. And honestly, it on one hand, it's more than I ever could have imagined it to be when
Yeah.
I thought it was an inherent, infallible word of God.
Yeah.
It's more than that, because I only knew about like 1.5 layers, right?
Yeah.
So it's more than that. But at the same time, I am keenly aware of how it's being used to manipulate and
Yeah.
deceive.
Control.
So
Okay.
that's still part of, I'm still a student of the Bible,
Yeah.
because so I'm that is still very much part of my journey.
Ongoing journey.
Yeah.
Okay, here's another question for you, Brandee, and this one's from me. I have been in a lot of the deconstruction chats, and before I say this, it's completely understandable. I've been angry too, but I see a lot of people that seem, at least, at a cursory glance, they seem to be staying in a place of being really, really angry. Like I said, I understand. I get it. I have dealt with my own anger of having been programmed and deceived and lied to, and all of that. Now, I don't feel like I'm as angry. Sometimes something will come up, like a Christian will hurl verses at someone who's just asking questions. That still makes me angry. Did you deal with a lot of anger? And if so, what are you in a place now where you're still kind of angry about the things that were done to you within the scope of being part of Christianity? Is that a good question?
Yeah, I definitely went through anger. I mean,
Sure.
there's no question about that. And I think one of the places where I still struggle with that
Yeah.
is how deconstructing has, um I would use my words carefully here, but it has reconfigured my family, not my
Well,
children
yeah.
and my husband, but my relationship with several family members that I
Yeah.
thought was unshakable
Yeah.
is non-existent,
Yeah.
because I started asking questions. I didn't even have beliefs. I just started asking questions, and
Right.
those
Yeah.
questions weren't allowed, and
Uh,
they were too scary. And so now we're going on 3.5 years of
yeah.
relationships that, like I said, I just could never have imagined going
Yeah.
south. And it hurts.
Yeah.
I
It
mean,
does.
it really hurts.
I
And
understand that.
that hurt does sometimes come out in anger, because the questions I have are legitimate. The
Yeah.
questions are
Yeah.
legitimate. They were legitimate. The evidence that I have found in response to those questions is legitimate.
Sure.
But what the I see basically that there seems to be two distinct paths, and there's a massive number of people waking up and asking the questions, and
Yes.
there's somewhere on this path.
Hmm.
And then there's the whole other group of people who are burying their heads further in the sand. And
Yeah.
it doesn't matter
Yeah.
what you say or what evidence you have or what heart you come at it with.
Hmm.
It doesn't matter how it's presented. They cannot handle it.
Yeah. That's true.
And several people in my life that I was close to are on that path, and I can't reach them. And I
Yeah.
don't know that it's my job to reach them, but
No.
I love
Yeah.
them.
Yeah.
So that's where my anger comes in. I
I
feel
get it.
like this is a big old psyop,
Yeah.
and I'm watching people that I love being
Hmm.
carried away. And not only that, it's causing them to not live their lives,
Yeah.
right?
Oh my gosh.
It
Yeah.
has robbed them of their lives on
Yeah.
so many fronts. And
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm watching that. So I still deal with anger,
Sure.
mostly for them, though, because I can, at this point, I can look at every step of my journey
Yeah.
as something I needed to go through,
Yes.
and every bit of it made me who I am now. And so
Yep.
there's no part of it that I would not want to experience,
Agreed.
but I want to run and just pull my loved ones out,
Yeah.
kicking and screaming, and say, please, just please come with me,
Sure. Yeah.
And but it's hard when you see that, like, it's,
Hmm.
yeah, I don't know how yet. how that will turn from anger and hurt to acceptance. I don't know what that's going to look like.
I mean, maybe it never will, Brandee.
Right.
Jen, do you have any questions for Brandee before we close up?
I don't at the moment. I've just been intently listening.
Yeah, I know. You've been here. I appreciate you being here. Brandee, do you want to talk about your Facebook page at all? I mean, that's totally up to you whether you want to or not.
Sure. I had a very active Facebook group that was a Christian truther based group.
Oh yeah,
It was my deception hunter group, right?
Yeah.
I guess you'd say, just pointing out all the things that we've talked about. And it was a decent sized group, but it was people who were seeing the same things that I was seeing. They were very much like on the same page. And then I began deconstructing, and I began just putting little tidbits in there.
Yeah.
And ironically, one of the guys that ran the group with me, he was also an admin. We left a Hebrew roots group together. He and I were friends, and we were like, "Hey, we're out of here. This is getting weird. Let's start our own group." And so we started that group together. And he did not come along in this direction. And honestly, it was just sharing basic things like, hey, take a look at this. What do you think of this? I'm not saying I believe this, but what is this? Anyway, then when deconstruction started, and I got some really nasty messages, and he wanted me out of his group. So, which I just don't do any of that drama. And I thought, it's time to start one like with the handful of people that, when we come across some, you need support in this. Like
you do.
It is not something you want to do alone. Right. Because it's scary, especially in the beginning. It's really scary.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people, I know people that it's been 2 and 3 years, and they're still feeling like they've abandoned God, or that they're going to get in trouble, or you know what I mean? There's still those things. And so I just felt that it was very important to have even just a small group of people that can say it's okay to ask these questions, and it's okay wherever you land.
Yeah.
You're not alone. We're not judging you. It's okay to ask. So I just started that group for like-minded people to just have a community.
That's wonderful. And there are lots of different types of people in there, and there's lots of information being presented all the time. And it's just a wonderful, safe place. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the broadcast, I would like this channel it's always been a safe place. I mean, even when Jen and I were in the more of the Christian place, Christian house, so to speak, we wanted to present a safe place for everyone to come, very open to what we would have termed back then as the unsaved. And, I mean, my goodness, we have an atheist on the panel. I mean, come on. I mean, how much more open can we be, right? And my open symbol I've used since I started True Story Live. And I have always been striving to be a person that's open to whatever anyone else believes. And I'm finally feel like I'm arriving there. It's not a pretense. I'm not fooling myself. It is, for the first time, really true and authentic. And I'm sure I still have work to do. I'm sure there are still some things that I need to work on. But I feel like I'm in the right place to be able to do that. I want this channel to be a safe place for people to tell their stories. And I hope that you felt safe, Brandee, sharing your story with us. And I know right now we don't have a whole lot of listeners anymore, but it's okay. I really feel like if we're doing something worthwhile, and we can get the stories out there and get people that are willing to share with us, then the people will come. And that's what my hope is, at least. But Brandee, thank you for taking time out of 2 of your Fridays to share with us, with the kids knocking on the door and wanting your attention. And it's just wonderful that you're here. thank you.
I really appreciate you having me. And I just wanted to say, I really love the concept of True Story Live. If there's one thing I've learned in all of this is that humans learn best, retain the information best, and understand the best through stories. You know, there's just, as a
So
homeschool
agree.
mom, I understand that. And now understanding different layers of the Bible and not taking it literally, and understanding that it's the stories that last forever. It's the stories that give us the deepest meaning and the
Yeah,
deepest understanding. And
that's
so
it.
I'm excited, and I can't wait to listen to other people's stories, because I think the more people who share, the more courage other people are going to have
Yeah.
to take that first step or
Yep.
take the next step. And so I love the concept, and I
Yeah.
fully support you guys. And
Thank
I don't
you.
know if I'll always hear it live, but I will
That's
definitely
okay.
be listening to the replays.
Well, thank you, Brandee.
I wanted to add something.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Have you noticed that, and I know we've all done this at times in our lives, but when you hear one fact about a person, it's so much easier to judge, and it's so easy to withhold empathy and sympathy and seeing them as a human. There's something that happens, like you were just saying, Brandee, when you hear someone's story. Like, I could hear a story about someone who came out to their parents as gay, just as
Yeah.
an example off the top. And back being a Christian and being in that box and being judgmental, in a way, and critical, having a snap judgment about someone, but then hearing their whole story, there's something that opens up our hearts
Yeah.
to empathy.
Yeah.
And it humanizes people. I think hearing stories, I just feel like there's so many, I don't want to say people, but there's so many opportunities in our world today to look at, like, I don't mean to say outright dehumanize people, but you know what I mean? Like, not seeing them as a person, maybe just
Yeah.
seeing them as wrong
Yeah.
or bad.
Right.
But there's
Or you
something
can't
about,
relate. You just can't relate
yeah,
to some of these
Yeah.
things. But
yeah.
we can relate
And
to the humanity in every human.
Yep.
yes, yeah. And that's why stories are so important. It's wonderful.
Thank you, Jen.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Both of you said some really good things about telling stories, and I mentioned at the beginning how much I love stories. So I've loved this, and if you're listening to this broadcast and you would like to share your story with us, I put my email and also Jen's email in the chat. Just send us an email, let us know your interest. Also, I am on Facebook. Jason Cripps is my name. If we're not friends on Facebook, you want to DM me, you can still send me a message. I'll get it there. And we'll see who has enough courage to come forward and tell their story next. And if no one raised their hand, then either Jen or myself will tell our story until
Woohoo!
someone comes forward. So we do plan on doing a broadcast again next Friday at 7 p.m. And don't know who it's going to be yet, but we'll see what we have by that point. So thank you, everyone who is joined us in the chat, and our friend Melted Zone, and of course for Brandee again for being a guest, and for Jen, and also Glenn in the chat. We'll see you guys next Friday. Everybody have a good weekend, and thank you for joining us tonight on True Story Live. See you next week.
Peace out.
Bye.